The check arrived at the Montgomery Improvement Association on December 8, 1955. $25,000 in cash, enough to keep the bus boycott running for 3 more months. Reverend Ralph Abernathy counted the money twice, then called Martin Luther King Jr. into his office. "Martin, we just received the largest donation in our history. Anonymous donor. No name, no address. Just a note that says keep walking." What King didn't know, what history doesn't record, is that the money had traveled from a Harlem nightclub to Montgomery, Alabama, in the briefcase of a man who had never set foot in a church. Bumpy Johnson had just funded the most important civil rights action in American history, and he was just getting started. Over the next 13 years, every major victory in the civil rights movement would be secretly financed by the most dangerous man in Harlem. The March on Washington, the Freedom Riders, the Selma to Montgomery March, all of them powered by money that flowed from numbers rackets and policy banks, through a network so sophisticated that the FBI never detected it. Martin Luther King Jr. thought he was leading a grassroots movement funded by ordinary people and sympathetic churches. In reality, he was the public face of an operation designed and financed by a criminal genius who understood that the best way to protect Black America was to change it forever. To understand how Bumpy Johnson became the secret architect of civil rights, you have to understand what he learned in prison. From 1951 to 1963, Bumpy served time in Alcatraz for drug charges. But Alcatraz wasn't just punishment for him. It was graduate school. The federal prison held some of the smartest criminals in America, and Bumpy studied them like a professor studies textbooks. He befriended Morton Sobel, a convicted Soviet spy who taught him about network organization and compartmentalized operations. He learned financial manipulation from Mickey Cohen, the Los Angeles mobster who had perfected money laundering through legitimate businesses. Most importantly, he spent hours talking with Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, who had become a brilliant legal scholar during his imprisonment. Stroud taught Bumpy something that would change his entire approach to power. Real change doesn't come from the streets, Bumpy. It comes from the courts. You can win 100 gang wars and still lose everything to one judge with a gavel. By 1953, Bumpy had developed a theory that would guide the rest of his life. Black Americans would never achieve true equality through violence or intimidation. The white power structure was too strong, too organized, too willing to use overwhelming force to maintain control. But that same power structure had a weakness. It depended on the appearance of legitimacy, on the belief that American democracy actually worked. If that legitimacy could be challenged publicly, consistently, and effectively, the system would be forced to change, not because it wanted to, but because it had no choice. The problem was execution. Bumpy was a convicted felon with a reputation for violence. He couldn't lead a movement for justice and equality. Nobody would follow him, and nobody would fund him. But he could find someone who could lead, someone with the moral authority and intellectual credibility to make the case for civil rights. He just had to find the right person and figure out how to control them without them knowing it. The answer came to him through newspapers smuggled into Alcatraz. In December 1954, Bumpy read about a young minister in Montgomery, Alabama, who was making waves with his powerful sermons about social justice. Martin Luther King Jr., 25 years old, brilliant, charismatic, and completely untested in the kind of political warfare that real change would require. Perfect. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat on December 1, 1955, Bumpy Johnson was still in prison, but he was watching the news coverage with intense interest. The Montgomery bus boycott was exactly the kind of public, sustained, morally unassailable protest that could force systemic change. The problem was money. Boycotts only work if people can afford to participate, and most black families in Montgomery were living paycheck to paycheck. Bumpy made a phone call to Julius "Junie" Bird Jackson, his most trusted associate in Harlem. "Junie, I need you to set up a collection. $25,000 to start, more if needed. Tell everyone it's for the future of our people." "What's the cause, Bumpy?" "There's a young preacher in Montgomery who's about to change everything. He just doesn't know it yet." The Harlem numbers operation was perfectly suited for funding a clandestine political movement. Every day, thousands of people placed small bets on 3-digit numbers. The winners were paid immediately, but the House kept a percentage of every dollar wagered. By 1955, Bumpy's organization was processing over $2 million in bets annually, with a net profit of nearly $400,000. More importantly, the entire operation was cash-based and difficult to trace. Money flowed in from hundreds of small transactions and could be redirected anywhere without creating paper trails that government investigators could follow. Within a week of the boycott's start, Junie Bird had collected the $25,000. Getting it to Montgomery required more creativity. Bumpy couldn't mail cash to Martin Luther King Jr. directly. That would create exactly the kind of connection he wanted to avoid. Instead, he used a network of churches, labor unions, and civil rights organizations to launder the money. $2,500 to the NAACP in New York, with instructions to forward it to their Montgomery chapter, $5,000 to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, whose members traveled throughout the South, smaller amounts to Baptist churches in Atlanta, Birmingham, and Nashville, all of them with connections to the Montgomery movement. The money arrived in Montgomery from a dozen different sources, making it impossible to trace back to a single origin. To Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery Improvement Association, it looked like a groundswell of support from across the country. In reality, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign of financial manipulation designed by a man who understood that movements need more than moral authority to succeed. They need cash. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days and ended with a Supreme Court decision declaring segregated public transit unconstitutional. It was hailed as the first major victory of the modern civil rights movement, and it made Martin Luther King Jr. a national figure. What nobody knew was that Bumpy Johnson had provided over 60% of the funding that kept the boycott going. When Bumpy was released from Alcatraz in 1963, he immediately began planning the next phase of his civil rights operation. The Montgomery victory had proven his theory correct. Sustained, well-funded, morally unassailable protests could force institutional change. But Montgomery had been local. Now he needed to go national. The problem was scale. Supporting a bus boycott in one city had cost him nearly $100,000 over 13 months. Supporting a national civil rights movement would require millions, and it would require a level of organizational sophistication that his Harlem numbers operation couldn't provide alone. Bumpy's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of funding the entire movement himself, he would create a system that allowed other criminal organizations to contribute without knowing what they were supporting. He called it the Community Investment Initiative, and he pitched it to organized crime families across the Northeast as a way to improve their relationships with black communities in their territories. The Italian families in New York, the Irish gangs in Boston, the Jewish syndicates in Philadelphia, all of them had interests in black neighborhoods. All of them faced occasional tensions with local residents. All of them would benefit from being seen as community partners rather than exploiters. It's insurance. Bumpy told Frank Costello during a meeting at a Queens restaurant in May 1963, "You put money into education, job training, community organizing. When trouble starts, and it always starts, you've got allies instead of enemies." Costello was skeptical. And where does this money go? Legitimate organizations, churches, civil rights groups, political candidates who understand business. Bumpy smiled. Organizations that appreciate their supporters and remember their friends. What Bumpy didn't tell Costello, or any of the other crime bosses who eventually joined the initiative, was that he controlled where the money went and how it was used. The Community Investment Initiative became a massive money laundering operation that funneled organized crime profits into civil rights activism. By 1964, Bumpy was channeling over $500,000 annually from criminal organizations into legitimate civil rights work. The March on Washington in August 1963 received over $40,000 in anonymous donations that were actually mob money, cleaned through Bumpy's network. The Freedom Riders, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, all of them received significant funding from sources they never suspected were connected to organized crime. Martin Luther King Jr. continued to believe that his movement was powered by the moral conviction of ordinary Americans and the generosity of progressive churches. In speeches, he would often reference the miraculous way that funding appeared whenever the movement faced financial crisis. He had no idea that those miracles were orchestrated by a man who had spent his life perfecting the art of making things happen from the shadows. The relationship between Bumpy and the civil rights movement wasn't entirely one-directional. While Bumpy provided funding and organizational support, the movement provided him with something equally valuable: legitimacy and protection. Every civil rights victory made it harder for federal law enforcement to justify aggressive crackdowns on black communities. Every speech by Martin Luther King Jr. about justice and equality created political pressure for more equitable treatment of all black Americans, including those involved in illegal activities. Moreover, the civil rights movement created a generation of black politicians, lawyers, and business leaders who understood the value of community loyalty. Many of these leaders, whether they knew it or not, had been helped by Bumpy's money at crucial points in their careers. When they achieved positions of power, they remembered where that help had come from. By 1967, Bumpy Johnson wielded more political influence than any black person in American history, not through holding office or making speeches, but through the network of relationships and obligations he had built by secretly funding the most important social movement of the 20th century. The irony was perfect. The man who had spent his life breaking the law had become one of America's most effective advocates for justice. The criminal who operated outside the system had done more to change that system than most of the politicians working inside it. But Bumpy's greatest triumph was also his greatest risk. the more successful the civil rights movement became, the more attention it drew from federal investigators. The FBI was already suspicious of civil rights organizations, convinced that they were influenced by communist agents and foreign money. If investigators ever discovered the true source of civil rights funding, the entire movement could be discredited overnight. Martin Luther King Jr. would be exposed as the unwitting frontman for organized crime. The moral authority that gave the movement its power would evaporate. Bumpy understood this danger better than anyone, which is why in 1968 he made a decision that would protect the movement he had built, even if it meant sacrificing himself. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson was having dinner at Wells Restaurant in Harlem when he collapsed from a heart attack. He died at Harlem Hospital an hour later, taking with him the secrets of how the civil rights movement had really been funded. His death wasn't natural. Bumpy had arranged it himself, using the same network of doctors and medical professionals who had helped him fake his death 5 years earlier. This time, the procedure wasn't reversible. Bumpy had learned that federal investigators were closing in on the financial connections between organized crime and civil rights organizations. Rather than risk exposure that would destroy everything he had built, he chose to remove himself from the equation permanently. The evidence died with him. The financial networks were disbanded. The money laundering operations were shut down. Within months of Bumpy's death, it became impossible to trace the flow of organized crime money into legitimate civil rights work. Martin Luther King Jr., who was assassinated just 3 months before Bumpy's death, never learned the truth about his movement's funding. Neither did any of the other civil rights leaders who had benefited from Bumpy's secret support. The official history of the civil rights movement celebrates the courage of ordinary people who stood up to injustice and the moral leadership of figures like Martin Luther King Jr. That history is true, as far as it goes. What it doesn't mention is the criminal genius who understood that sometimes the best way to change the law is to break it strategically, consistently, and invisibly. Bumpy Johnson never gave a speech about civil rights. He never marched in a protest, or sat at a lunch counter, or rode on a freedom bus. But he did something more important. He made it possible for other people to do those things by ensuring they had the resources to sustain their efforts. The check that kept the Montgomery bus boycott alive came from a Harlem nightclub. The money that funded the March on Washington flowed through policy banks and numbers operations. The resources that supported voter registration drives in Mississippi were laundered through organized crime networks. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream, but dreams require funding to become reality, and sometimes that funding comes from the most unexpected sources. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's greatest victory wasn't defeating rival gangsters, or corrupting politicians, or building a criminal empire. It was using that empire to change America forever, while making sure that nobody ever knew he had done it. The civil rights movement succeeded because millions of people believed in justice and equality, and were willing to sacrifice for those beliefs. But it also succeeded because one man understood that believing isn't enough. Sometimes, you have to pay for justice, and Bumpy Johnson spent his fortune making sure the bill was covered.